Siphokazi Jonas has the power of the spoken and written word. She is a poet, performer, and producer, and with her first collection of poetry recently published, Weeping Becomes a River, Siphokazi is now an author as well. If you're a keen follower of South Africa, you'll have seen her and heard her voice at some point on a promo for South African tourism, in her own film, We Are Dying Here, and narrating the film, The People of the Sun. Siphokazi Jonas is a teller of stories, and she's my guest on this episode of Fearless with Uduak Amimo. Siphokazi, it's such a pleasure to have you on this podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Uduak. It's a pleasure for me as well. I really look forward to speaking with you.
So, Siphokazi, from where I sit, 10 names is a bit much for one child. What kind of child is given 10 names at birth?
It's a bit disingenuous of me because those are I only actually have two names. I have one first name and my surname Siphokazi Jonas. But because, as we know, as Africans, we have clan names, and so the names that have are my history, that carry the history of my ancestry on my father's side, on my mother's side. So when I speak, it's actually more than 10 names. It's more so Mamdakwendo, Kwange, Shuvele, Mgubeni, and so on my father's side. On my mother's side, Mamngoche, Uvela, and so on. So coming from different tribes within the Xhosa Nation from my dad, Amatembu from my mother's side. So it's really my lineage. So when I say I've been given many names, there are names that belong to me, that belong to my sisters, that belong to my cousins, my parents, and so on. So when I say I have all those names, I mean I belong to many, many, many streams of belonging.
And so, how would you introduce yourself in a cultural context, in a clan context, if you're with your mother's people and if you're with your father's people?
Well, generally, people would take on their father's clan names, and that's how it's done. So, Mamda Gwende, Maleta Velemkubeni, Kwangesho Mboyo, Libele. So those are on my father's side. But because, as a writer, I'm always thinking, especially as a feminist, you're thinking about what it means to belong to your mother as well, just as much what it means to claim your heritage from your mother's side. So when my aunt, for example, sees me, she will, before she even says hello Spogazi, she will say, "Aw, maleta, mamda kwendeva." It's called ukbonga, which means to praise. And so when you receive someone, you praise them. When you introduce yourself, it's called ukuzituta, which means to carry yourself or to move yourself. And so it's to do so, to bring your people along with you wherever you go. But so I think it's my, as a writer, as a storyteller, my reclaiming of my mother's clan names as well is to say I belong to both all the time.
So, of the many names you have, your adoring fans, you have told us that your first name is Spokazi, and that's how we know you. What does your name mean? What does Spokazi mean?
Sipokazi means great gift. So Sipo, it's generally a Nguni name. And I'm from the Xhosa clan or the Xhosa nation, really. I think there's also sort of a conversation around thinking about the reduction of nations into tribes because of colonization. So thinking of I'm from the isiXhosa nation, and Sipo means gift. Kazi is both the feminine version of the word, but also Kazi means great. So my name is Great Gift. Siphokazi. That's what it means.
What a great gift you are. So, what led you or called you to the performing arts? How did you arrive at this place of becoming a nation storyteller?
That it's difficult to really trace a beginning because when I think about becoming a storyteller, becoming a writer, becoming a performer, there's ways in which I would say, okay, I enjoyed poetry and I uh, attended I Stedfords and I was a drama kid in school through and through. But I think there's also a way of asking my parents when that began because they would have watched me growing up, understanding my love of books. My love of books started very, very young. I spent so many years in a library. And we like to say that writers are readers first. So I think my love of writing, my love of performance actually started through the consumption of books, through the consumption of media. My mother would tell us "insomi," which is such a significant part of my own upbringing and formation as a writer, my formation as a storyteller. which is through Xhosa tales, Insomi, these fantastical tales that build worlds where animals have the same characteristics as humans and interact with the same kinds of human dynamics would be worked out in the animal world and then brought back to resolution for the community, which I mean we can talk about a bit later, but it's something that I've also done in my book where I've reimagined Insomi in a modern way and in conjunction and in conversation with poetry. So I would think of my mother likes to tell the stories of how I would mess with words as all children do, you know. So for example, the name of a mosquito, ingcongconi in isiXhosa, but I would say ingcongcotane. So she always says I've had poetic license. So just as a child, just as a toddler, messing with words, she remembers all these words that I would uh, mess with, that I would sort of make up uh, instances of pretending to be a TV presenter in front of the mirror, you know, using the back of a comb or using a roll on bottle, whatever it is. So whether it at church, actually hearing, you know, being told children's stories at church and loving to tell those stories back, telling stories to our parents, telling stories to each other, to our cousins during the holidays and so on. So although I might think of storytelling as this formal role that I play, but I think through childhood play, through interaction, through community, through being with family, that is an ongoing thing that, you know, if you listen to his post, if you listen to, I would actually stake anything on this, that if you listen to any conversation, any people, any nation on the African continent, storytelling is part of who we are. It's in our DNA. It's in how we transmit ideas and ideologies and connect and actually really just archive our own histories. So I was born to be a storyteller. I'm only fortunate that now it's something that I can say helps me to make a living. So I could probably give an easy answer and be like, okay, in school I used to love poetry, I used to perform here, I used to write this, and then eventually I had a teacher that supported me to get there, and I studied English literature, and so all of those things are wonderful. But I like to trace it to my mother, for example, who was denied her own love of poetry in school because of apartheid. She tells us how she was really good at reciting poetry when she was a child, but there was no space in that time for them to be able to pursue artistic interests. And then at a time when they changed language, the language of instruction to Afrikaans, which means one couldn't pursue certain subjects, certain interests. And so I always think of something that was denied my my grandmothers, my grandfathers, my mother, my father, all of those things that were denied have been passed through the blood. And now I'm very fortunate. In fact, I'd actually like to read your poem. I think this would
This
be
would be a good
the
place for
perfect
it,
time.
for you to show us that you are your ancestors' wildest dream.
Absolutely. And this poem is really a reflection of the things that are both lost, but that belong to me as well. It's nice and short, so I'll read the whole poem. This poem is Birthright. I receive the things my grandmothers left for me in a dream. Mother and father have gardening. I have poems, rent, and no land. Omakulu show me how to soften poems for digestion, sorting and soaking beans and samp overnight. One grandmother winnows my words with wind. The other treats my mouth ulcers with courage. Look at all these pages. I am heir to women who bore the weight of the river on their heads without spilling. And I think this poem speaks to that lineage of dreams denied, dreams deferred. And I find my courage from that and to make sure that I live out my dreams as fearlessly as possible.
There's a lot in that because there is inheritance, there is legacy, there's also patriarchy, the women's burden, you know, fetching water. There is access to medical care. There's so much, and you've been talking about your family, your parents, you talk about your grandmothers in that poem. Siphokazi, whose child are you?
Oh, goodness. That was a beautiful segue to actually thinking about that. My parents are Ndombenja. and Utemba Jonas. Those are my parents. I know some. I unfortunately don't have any living grandparents, but some passed before. One passed before I was born. One passed soon after um, I was born, about 2 years after I was born, and the others once when I was in primary school and then in high school. So unfortunately, I don't have living grandparents, but those are my parents. Those are my parents. Yeah, that's who I belong to, and obviously a much wider community.
Certainly. And when we then come to the grandparents, some of whom you met, and I feel your pain when you say no one's living, because there's a certain gift when you have grandparents, and it's a loving, safe and stable relationship. It is such a gift. And so they give you the words, they give you your love for the soil, they tend to you, they nurture you. Was there a conscious acceptance of those gifts, recognizing that this dream is manifesting in you, and so you accept the dream? Or was it just, I've graduated from pretending to be a newsreader, and playing with hairbrushes and things to, oh my word, look at that, I'm on stage. It just emerged. Was there a
Oh
conscious?
goodness, I wish. It was certainly a very scenic route to get here because, and I think that maybe perhaps this poem also captures that, is that our parents lived with this anxiety of having stable employment, and we're right to. I'm the first artist and certainly professional artist in my family,
I was
so I
coming to
lived
ask you
with.
that because hey, you want to be broke, lawyer, doctor, engineer, artist.
Oh
Why
yeah.
would you do yourself?
It came at a very high cost because when it came to grade 12 and it was time to choose going to university and which course, I knew what I wanted to do and I knew what I wanted to be, but there was this question of, all right, but how are you going to make a living? And the example of a lot of local artists that my parents had generally died destitute, that perhaps if they were fortunate they'd become famous, but they'd lose all that money and have a pauper's funeral, and most of the others were unknown anyway. So there was no model for me within my family for sure, and then within my larger community. So I remember, and I love sharing this, I eventually just registered for biotechnology. I don't know why I went for one of the harder sciences, but I'd done science in high school, so I thought, I'm sure it'll be fine. It was definitely not fine. I failed my first year of university epically. In fact, I was academically excluded. And so my dad was like, all right, that's it, clearly you're not serious about your future. You can just like go find a job. And my uncle was like, no, okay, let's have a conversation about this. And it was this sense of knowing what I wanted to be, but there was no clear pathway. I didn't have a template of how to get there. So eventually, through much negotiation, I was able to then register for a BA in English literature and drama. So even English literature sort of came in there as a safety net, because there's like the idea of becoming an actor or performance artist was just no. How are you going to make a living? I think it was a fair question. Even now, the industry is so saturated that it is sometimes difficult to make it, so to speak. So I had to have a very brutal first year in, in the science department. Eventually, they're like, okay, just go do this thing, but you have to try and make the best out of it. Um, so did my undergrad all the way to a master's in English literature. And then at some point I was like, okay, now, which was another conversation of, all right, because I was sort of getting onto the academic track. I was in the middle of applying for my doctorate. And I was like, actually, I think I want to do this full time, not just as a side hustle. Whoa, another conversation, another difficult conversation. And I really do empathize with my parents for having me as a
What
daughter
sort of
because,
questions were they asking you?
well, again, it was is the question of how are you going to make a living? Why would you leave this secure track to go and do something because it's your passion, because it's your dream? And I think it really was the fact of not having examples, not clear examples of success and how one actually makes a living. And I feel that what I'm doing now, hopefully, is to try and set that template. My hope is that there's some other young Siphokazi somewhere in a small town with a similar history, with a very different history, who can look at the work that I've done, who can look at some of the things I've been able to achieve through collaboration, through working with other people, and starting my own thing and not waiting for someone else to cast me in an audition, someone else to, tell me what to do, but really starting so many things up, um, and having an enduring energy, having an enduring energy in being sure that what I have to say matters. Because for me, it's being a black woman, being a black African, being a black South African. When you speak about representation, we always think about, there's this model of someone that we can put up there that people can look up to. But for me, it's simpler. It's really saying some of these things that I've shared with you now, these stories of where I come from. It's just making space for that voice, making space to share those stories, not simply with the intention of being a representation for someone else, just being a representation of myself, of my family, of my community. Create space for someone else to feel that their voice, their story is valid. So I don't believe in this concept of being a voice for the voiceless. No one is voiceless. For me, I see the importance of creating platforms that allow people to tell their own stories, to be their own voice, and to share their own stories. So it's always making space, creating opportunities, collaborating, making platforms so that everyone can find space to share their story that wants to. So that's what matters to me.
And so you start telling stories. What topics, what stories do you tell in your first performance, your first play, your first poem? What needs to come out?
So this is a lot of fun. I have the books that I wrote poetry in. I probably should have brought these, but I have the books that I wrote poetry in when I was in high school. I started writing when I was about 14. And I was very fortunate to have an English teacher who would then read those poems and give me some feedback. There was a lot of teenage angst, just general things that I look at now and thinking it wasn't that serious. Just angst. Um, but what was interesting, and some of it was just almost these meta poems where I write about writing, when I'm sitting in the classroom and I'm writing, and that's the poem. But I saw there were poems about the Iraqi war. This is around 2001. There are poems about homeless children. There are poems about stories, things happening in the village. There are poems about depression, and I was quite surprised because these are things that still matter to me. Thinking about the stories that come from the margin, thinking about uh, oppression, sort of larger institutional suppression of any kind of resistance. So I was surprised that I was grade 10, grade 9, writing about a village that had been destroyed by American soldiers. And I don't know why I was thinking about that perspective already at that age in a little town in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, because I really don't think our education was giving us any kind of complicated perspective. But I remember someone was actually speaking about writing thinking through what's happening in Palestine at the moment. And I remember saying that this is not new for me to write in response to injustice. I literally have poems from when I was 14, 15, questioning power imbalances. So I'm fortunate. I'm happy to see that thread has continued in my work, and that it's not a performative or trendy thing for me. Is that it matters about which perspectives are actually brought into the conversation, because art is powerful, writing is powerful.
In addition to injustice, being an admirer of yours, a follower of your work, there is the attention to language. And I hear that in a lot of your work. I read it, I see it. Um, and it's almost like a statement to say, a reclamation of language, or, a stamp of language to say, this is who I am. Excuse me, please. This is who I am. And this is the language of my people. And it will show up in my work. Am I reading that correctly, or is there more to it, or something I'm missing in terms of how language shows up for you in your work?
I think the best way to exemplify that is to read a poem. Um, so this is This is straining cloth. Yes, so another sort of shortish one. After crucifying ubuXhosa bam, wounds dressed in school uniform, tongue bound for 6 hours to avoid detection and detention, then migrating home by bus to hydrate with ginger beer. I wish I'd asked the ground ginger, dredged through a straining cloth, how it felt to surrender the flavor of its body to a drink, then be discarded. Wars are won and lost with bodies. In former white schools, we were Thonia's bones securing victory for Athens, breaking the architect of apartheid's curse over Bantu education in exchange for new accents to finesse our way into white economy. Had I foreseen my excavation, a heap of ex miners and domestic workers eroded to silicosis and arthritis, black employees code switching daily, wounds dressed in traditional costume on Heritage Day, I would have been less annoyed by traces of ginger escaping a straining cloth to lurk at the bottom of my glass and in my throat. Your reading of the place of language in my work is absolutely accurate. And it comes really from navigating the loss of that language. Because I was, one of the first Black students in an Afrikaans school, in a white school, in the small town where I grew up. Then we went to an English boarding school where we weren't allowed to speak your mother tongue. So you weren't allowed to speak isiXhosa on school grounds. You'd actually get to be punished and go to detention. So this linguistic alienation, this cultural alienation that's happened over time, as dressed up as this idea. I think we're called something about the Mandela generation. So the early '90s, mid '90s, during the transition years of South Africa, and being sent to these Model C former white schools because that was the idea of what a better life is for Black children in that time, has led to this rupture, this cultural and personal rupture between English and isiXhosa, English and any mother tongue, but also belonging between ourselves and our families, because you are trained to be part of the English empire in essence, because those schools, that's the work they were doing. They were always things sort of as bastions of colonization in education. And so my reclamation of language and thinking through about the rupture and how it leads to hybridity is really the core of what my work is about, because it's a work of reclaiming myself and my own belonging, and knowing that there's no pure way of being Xhosa. There's no pure way of being English even. So it's moving constantly in the in-betweenness of all of these spaces. So in this book itself, it has been actually spending time with those wounds and seeing what it means for me to just decide how I want to do it, decide how I want to mess around with this closet, decide how I want to mess around with English, and claim confidently that this is where I belong in that in betweenness.
Listening to you, I'm reminded of the Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who similarly engaged with language and at some point decided to publish only in his mother tongue. And despite his body of work and contributions to literature, um, there are those who feel that this is part of the reason why he has not. And I think he believes that as well, that it's part of the reason why he has not won a Nobel Prize, as his peers, Wole Soyinka and the rest of them, have been recognized for their literary accomplishments. What then, when you hear about the experiences of people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and various others who are navigating power dynamics on global platforms, which you are doing, and what that could mean for your career?
Oh, that's a great question, because there's also things that I've done in this book that, in conversation with my editor, we were saying there's this instinct sometimes as writers from the global majority. I think the shift is away from this idea of the global south to the global majority. This instinct to explain ourselves, to feel like we have to interpret, we have to translate who we are to generally the white gaze, but also to the West, so to speak, to say, okay, this is how I translate I want to make sure that you understand me. And I think that's exactly what you're speaking about in this case. So I had a breakdown. I had a breakdown in the beginning of this process, of the editorial process, because I didn't realize that I had a habit of, even though I know I'm very adamant about this idea of not explaining what I'm saying. But there was still a habit to write something in isiXhosa and then find a way of translating it in the text itself. It's covert, but it's there. And I didn't realize I had this voice in my head. Maybe it's my English teacher, so this idea of who the reader is. And my editor asked, "Who do you write for?" She said, "Are you writing in search of yourself, or are you writing to be understood by white readers?" I had a breakdown. I cried. I said to her, "Look, I'm not going to be able to attend to this feedback until I have this breakdown. So today I'm just crying. I'll let you know tomorrow." Because this question was so foundational. And that was the question of who do I write for? Said because when you really write for yourself, when you really write for those like you know you don't have to explain an idea. You know what it means to introduce yourself with your clan name. You know the significance of that culturally. So you don't feel the need to explain. So what I've done in the book is some terms do have a gloss in the glossary, but there are things in, so the book is split into two parts. It's the section that has the tale. So there's an isiXhosa tale. It's written in English, but it carries throughout the book, and there are episodes of poetry in between. So there's 31 poems, but then there's an overarching story that tells the journey of this girl and her, there's a whole adventure. It's quite an adventure to go through it. And it means you can actually read the book in three ways. You can just read the story, then read the poetry. You can just read the poetry, then read the story, or you can follow the chronology and read the story with the poetry and the story and so on. So there are parts of the story that are not translated into English as a way of, first of all, none of the isiXhosa is italicized. So the language all holds the equal prominence on the page, because then otherwise we're othering the text by putting my mother tongue in italics and English not. But then there are parts where, for example, there are little chants and songs in the tale that are meant to do something in shifting the plot, and those are not translated because you either understand or you don't. But also because I think there's power that's held in isiXhosa itself, that we don't want to dilute the magic of what the story does, of what the song does in the story, of what the dialogue does. So what it's also doing is that for an English speaker, for a monolingual speaker, it creates a kind of distance. And because my book is about alienation, I do actually want the reader who doesn't speak my mother tongue to feel the struggle of linguistic alienation in my book. And so to actually experience the struggle of being out on the outside for once, and the kind of work needed, that if you want to understand, you'll ask someone who knows, you'll get on Google Translate, you'll do whatever it is that you need to do. But it does take a little bit of work to engage this book, and hopefully by the end to understand something of what has been my entire existence.
So, I mean, there is so much to unpack because when you describe the structure, it sounds like you've gone for the traditional African storytelling structure. Because remember when they would gather us around, like as children say, and every culture has an entry point into the story. There was always, I mean, I don't remember what it was in Kenya, but certainly um, I have this memory of once upon a time, and then, the children be calling back time, and then, the hare did this, and then the hare ran, and then somebody would get up and run, and then they would stop, and then they would sing a song, for the hare to do something or the other. And it sounds as if this is what you have transposed into your book. So
Yes,
that's one layer.
100%.
And then the second layer is of saying that I am correcting this injustice of the otherization of my mother tongue, whatever mother tongue that might be, but of any language that is not a Western language. And so no italics for a language that is not Western. And then the third is now you get to feel what it feels like for the rest of us who don't speak your Western languages and have no access and have to understand or have to ask someone, you know, to gain access into your literary world. So there's a lot going on in your book, which I am looking forward to reading once it becomes available to the rest of the world. Um, but it's also, and because I'm not just a fan, I've been stalking you, Spokazi. So I know that it's coming from Penguin, and most of us who love words will recognize Penguin from the books that we read, the set books, the texts that we were reading in
Mm.
school. So what does it mean for you to come, you know, with this rebelliousness to say, I may have read your books, you know, in literature class. Now you will publish my book and you'll publish it the way I want on my own terms.
Mm. It's been wonderful. It's sweet poetic justice. It really is because a section of the book is is called Prospero's Island, and it's
Ariel and
where
Prospero.
I use yes,
Shakespeare.
yes. Yes, I did my master's thesis on actually the teaching of Shakespeare in South Africa. So I've just always enjoyed messing with Shakespeare, and so taking this character, this almost revered character of Prospero, and bringing it into the form of the Xhosa Insomi, and he's a menacing, dark figure. He's not the hero, because I know it's always like thinking we're positioned as Caliban, those of us based because of our experience of colonization and so on. But my thing has always been like, Prospero stole that island. Prospero stole the island. Like, it's not okay. Yes, he was cast out and they took his kingdom or whatever, but he stole that island and he was a tyrant. So in the book, I think, okay, it'll be out now, but let me not spoil it actually for those who haven't read it yet. But it's exactly that for me, that I enjoy being able to have this exploration and this rebellion against the language that has been formative for me, and then to have Penguin. So for me, if this book were to become some kind of classic, I think it would be the height of irony, and I'd love it
This is
for the book
subversive.
as
This is
well.
subversive work, seditious work, no?
This is my hope. Yes, yes. And I think the other part of it, as much as I'm speaking about the experience of a non Nguni speaker, for example, with a book, it's not actually the main focus. The main focus is for other people who've had this experience, and not just in South Africa, but have had this experience of alienation, to be able to find themselves within the work and to have space to think through and process their own experience, their own wounds. So it's that two part where some people will feel alienated, some people will feel more belonging than ever, and that's more of interest to me.
Yeah, I call it subversive and seditious with my tongue in my cheek because obviously, um, and you'll know this better than I do in terms of how apartheid is so regulated the Black South African experience in terms of education, in terms of thinking, that even this sort of claiming your own agency was punishable, was seen as
Yes,
an act of
absolutely.
defiance, and merited strict response from the law at the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And although we say, all the laws and so on may have been repealed and changed and so on, but the legacy of that continues, and it's often along class and race lines that continue in South Africa to this day. And there's a deep, because the other part of it as well is thinking about the role of colonization in faith, and how it was used within religious structures to be, to keep the native down, so to speak. And I actually want to read part of a poem that's, speaking of being tongue in cheek, that's a little bit of a satire, playing on the idea of Leviticus in the Bible, and the giving of rules to priests. So I think anyone who has experienced the legacy of colonization on this continent and anywhere else may find something to relate to here. This is Leviticus for the African Mission, verse 1 to 9. Ship the holy flame across the sea, and be not discouraged by the objecting native who imagines his beliefs adequate. This is the resistance of darkness to light. Rewrite his gods as sin and savage. Convince him of his need for salvation, hitherto avoided for millennia. Initiate the sons of chiefs, not kings. Warn them against measuring themselves equal to monarchs whose interests have sponsored your mission. Daughters and common folks will be last to catch new fires. Spare not the rod of civilization. Present native child to school desk as if to an altar, under the discipline of scripture and Shakespeare, until the smoke which embitters the nose sweetens in the lungs. Conclude his conversion with confession. Inculcate a willingness to bear rejection from his tribe and the empire as an ordinance of God. So mindful of heaven, he may consent to enter it through the back door. Heed the words of the prophets. Their offspring shall be born, mouths white with ash to confront the flame. When they do, deny ever setting them alight. Amen.
Amen, Siphokazi.
Yeah.
Let's just, yeah, and because you're Christian, I believe you're a practicing Christian,
Yes.
and so am I, and so this tension between our faith and white supremacy, and the conflation of Christianity and the faith with white
Mm-hmm.
supremacy, and and I was having a conversation earlier, and we see the trend around the world of people of color, global majority folk, rejecting Christianity and other Western faiths for their traditional ancestral religions, because how can you believe in the faith of your or the God of your oppressor? How can you believe in the God of your colonizer? How can you believe in the God of the people of your killers, of your rapists, of the people who have stolen from you? How do you reckon with that tension, Spokasi?
I'm still figuring it out. I'm still figuring it out. It's a new uh it's a new process of doing that figuring out, because there is a kind of, as you say, that conflation with white supremacy is honestly even physically violent. So you feel that, sometimes even something, there's something we call isinu, which is kind of isinu, which is a rhythm. There's like in Isixhosa songs, ukwisinu, which is like a kind of rhythm that literally connects to the body and to the spirit, so that when you sing, you can feel the beat, you can feel the rhythm in a very specific way, which you don't find in the hymnal. When you're sort of singing from a hymnal. And so there's even the idea of worship. There's this kind of separation between, and again, it depends on perhaps which denomination one belongs to, but there's this way of worship that is almost, uh, I guess, because of the roots. Because if you think about, maybe some churches have American missionaries or German missionaries or whatever the source is. So this replication of what that looked like. So I can't give a conclusive answer. These are still conversations that I'm having, and I'm trying to figure out where I'm located within that. But there is this sort of this feeling of, what does faith look like? What does worship look like? What has been demonized because of, again, colonial interest, as I say, within the work, and some things that are deemed a certain way because of that. What things can exist together? So I don't have an answer, and that's the fun part for me, is that I get to just work these things out in poetry, get to work them out in conversation. I'm completely comfortable in maybe looking back in 5 years and be like, I've completely changed my mind on that. This is where I am. And so that's sometimes the risk of publishing. where you say you are in a certain place in your thinking, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 years later you're in a different place. So there is a risk even to your own growth or being able to articulate where you are. But as an artist, it's worth it because I guess we get to be public with our uncertainties, which not everyone gets to do. Sometimes it's just like, okay, you figure it out with your friends, with your family, with your community. But here, the risk, the authenticity that I've allowed myself in this book is to ask uncomfortable questions and to say, yes, I'm a Christian. Yes, I have these questions. I don't have any clear overlaps or cross points between these two. Hey, let me write a book and then we'll get together and talk about it. Hope for the best.
Right. And so you talk about this exploration, and I wonder what it means when because for the artist, really, the exploration is their interiority, your life. So you're mining your experiences, your thinking, everything about you. What does this mean within the context of family? These people who have sat you down and said, you need to make a living, what choices are you making? Who then start looking at you askance and thinking, I had better not see myself in your book, And that thing I
Whew.
told you was not for publication. And
Yes,
she's
yes.
coming for dinner. Just please make sure you don't say anything that she's going to write about. Okay.
You know my life. I remember there's a time my dad, so when parents tell you stories, he was starting to say something. My mom was like, "Hey, careful, she's gonna put that in a poem." I'm like, "Mom, maybe, but please don't don't deny me family history because of that." Um, I don't know. This is my first book, so I'm about to find out what the fallout might be. I'll keep you in the loop about that. But I've tried to be really careful about telling my story. Yes, there are elements of speaking about family, but it's in relation specifically to my story and what I feel is something that's shared and shareable. I always am very careful to not tell someone else's story without their permission, without consent. And so I try to think of how things maybe have affected me, think about things primarily in relation. It sounds selfish, but sort of you become the main character, and you think about how dynamics have affected how you relate to others in the world, how you move, how you connect, how you don't connect. So I've done my best to be really careful, um, and then just sort of hope for the best and let that be the conversation. But I really tried not to share things that loved ones wouldn't want shared. And that's I mean, I wouldn't want that for myself. I wouldn't want that someone to share something about me that's I've done my best to be careful about that.
So that's at the family level. But what about the community level? And I'm going into community because you wrote a poem which seemed to take stock of the community experience of COVID. Um,
Yes,
could I ask you to read that poem for us and then we can process it? Thank you.
absolutely. Absolutely. What does not sink? Ufikile unogumbe, ugalelekile, akankqonkqozi udilize umgubasi. There is a flood inside our house. The water climbs up the walls when we weep. It does not let us breathe. Everything is wet with grief. Before this pandemic, we would cast a funeral song into the dark like a flare, and the neighbors would come to strengthen our arms as we drove the water out the door. Before grief reached our ankles, before it swept us to our knees, before it flowed into the pots and our beds, to mourn meant a community gathered like a bank between you and the river of death. Now death has dampened this ritual. We mourn alone. The neighbors lift their own arms to relieve the water in their lungs. We are all drowning. This flood has reached into the inner rooms and quenched lives young and old. It has taken what we are not ready to lose. It spits the stories of the living into the street as injured furniture. Like the pensioner in line for a social grant, whose life has no space to protest a beach until she returns home clothes soaked, or the man who dies for a beer in his own backyard, the nurse tying a tattered mask together with prayer and is still unprotected, or the artist who contemplates eating her own words to ease her hunger, and art starves. This flood ruins us all. But what of the after? When the depth of this moment is absorbed by history, who will we be? We are a people who know how to rebuild out of the remnants of disaster, and we will do it again and again. When we salvage what is usable, may we find ourselves baptized into something new, new ways of mourning, a people who have learned to breathe underwater, reciting the names of those we have lost, and memories that never sink.
Thank you. So, I mean, everything resonates with me, but this poem, "What Does Not Sink," particularly because I started this podcast during COVID, with the intention for everyone, us, to reimagine the world as a better place. We thought this would be the one disaster that made humanity look ahead and think, a hard stop on our wasteful, destructive practices, and renewal into sustainability, kindness, care. So it's a heavy poem. There's a lot of grief. There's a line there: the artist eating her own words to stay alive. What was the pandemic experience like for you?
Difficult. Difficult, especially at the beginning. I have never had an opportunity to doubt my path as making a living as a storyteller until COVID. Then it led to a sort of existential crisis where I thought, why, how, what are we doing? So the first thing was this dissolution of structure because we lost live audiences and we rely on live audiences. So when you don't have the very people who receive, so it's you start thinking, why do I create art? Is it just for consumption? Is it just for the act of creation? Because now there's the people that would usually receive it and ensure that I have some kind of income are at home. We're all at home. And then there were also some strange responses on social media around whether or not, okay, we knew we weren't essential workers as artists, apparently, although people were listening to music and watching films and wearing clothes and all of these wonderful things that artists make. But yeah, so we'll leave that irony. But I remember there was a conversation on Twitter in South Africa around whether artists should be able to claim for unemployment. And people were thinking, no, why? Because we pay 25% tax, but not allowed. You don't have a salary. All of these things. So this sense of artists not having any real contribution to society. So in this moment when everything is stripped away from everyone, instead of sort of coming together, there was a sense of what benefit are you? What do you contribute to society? Um, and that was something difficult to reckon with. And then obviously work. So I remember just this feeling of emails coming in of work canceled, 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 canceled. It started with postponements, and then we realized lockdown was going to be more. And South Africa had a hard lockdown, uh, more than 21 days, and it's just cancel, cancel, cancel. So I was very fortunate to have some remote work come in and be able to do some writing because I, poet, actor, producer, writer. So all of these things allowed me to have sort of multiple things I could plug into. But it shifted a lot for me. And I remember there was a point actually, and I like sharing the story because where I just hadn't been able to pay rent for 3 months and my parents were like, girl, you need to just come home, we'll figure it out after COVID what happens, when. And I think I asked them to give me 2 weeks. I said, if nothing comes up in 2 weeks, I'm packing everything I had could fit into one room, into just my bedroom, because I had my table there, my chair, just my clothes, my bed. That's all I had. I said, if nothing comes in the next 2 weeks, I'm coming home, I'm packing up, I'm coming home. Thankfully, thank God, something did come in and I was able to pay rent. So, but in that time, it was also, you know, it was an encouragement to really be resilient in kind of pushing, even though there were all these things that seemed to lead into this existential crisis, to remember actually, not only is this a calling and purpose, but it's whether people see it or not, there's still a contribution for someone that is still, there's still impact. And you get constantly messages of people, how people are impacted by the words, how people are impacted by the work. The other perhaps more not logistical, but kind of pragmatic ways in which you change, it actually opened the world up for me, because I was able, we had work that screened online that was able to travel to different countries. That was actually the opening for me to get more into filmmaking. And since COVID, I've made sort of 3 short films that have gone around the world and so on. So it actually ended up in a very strange way, the world became less localized for me and became a lot broader. And I've had wonderful opportunities to travel and connect with people from different parts of the world. So it was a very mixed experience.
Even with the difficulty, it was a gift.
Yes, yes.
You're doing all sorts now. And listening to you and the power you have, I go into a trance when I hear you perform. It's easy to think, and you've just debunked that, as through your COVID experience. But it's easy to think that you jumped out of your mother's womb with your many clan names, and were, this, became this overnight success. Outside of the pandemic experience, what have been the darkest, hardest, messiest parts of your journey as an artist?
Okay, the challenge is going to be narrowing them down. So let me see if I can pick the highlights. The probably the most enduring is that push and pull with the parental figures, because as I've said before, like even when there are times when maybe things aren't going quite as well, so this question of where's the stability in your career, right? So that question is sort of, I think, something that's always the back of our head, especially because I just abandoned an academic career. I'm just like, let me go be a full-time artist. Um, so the sense of having to justify your your work to your community as something valuable. So there's that aspect, and that's something that you have to find. It's really internal. It's sort of an internal conviction that one must have, because there are many valid reasons not to do this. Unfortunately, I'll have to be honest, but you must find conviction about your why you're connected, and why you have to continue doing it. I would say, even on a practical level, not everyone has to be a full-time artist. That's not necessarily everyone's calling. For me, it really is about the time. The main thing that I want out of being a full-time artist is the time that I need to create and to be able to travel and so on. The second, uh, oh gosh, I remember the time when I had the number of times my sisters have had to sort of bail me out. I remember the time when I had 1 meal left. I was living in a shared community, there were about 5 of us, and I didn't have income at the time. This was before COVID, and I remember I had just 1 meal left. It was like 2 pieces of chicken and some vegetables, and I just cooked everything. It was like a 4-piece chicken tray, and then I just cooked everything I had, and I was just like, I have no idea what's coming next, and I'm not telling anyone in the house. I'm just like, um, so there's a mental health strain in the sort of so-called hustle and the push and the perseverance. It actually takes some strain sometimes to constantly have to persevere. So thankfully, my sister was able to help me out there a little bit until another gig came through. So I think learning how to tie things together into a career, into a sustainable career, that takes time. I've been doing this for a very long time, and it's sort of this work of building is quite extensive before you can feel as if there's some sustainability. The mental health strain for me is there. Then other things that really take a hit, like I remember 2 events in Johannesburg, due to poor planning, poor marketing, all of these other things. I once had an audience that had 20 people in a 1,000 seater venue, and then 24 people in a 1,500 seater venue. Still, we performed, we did the full show. We gave those 20 people the entire experience. So that was difficult to come from a different city. I would go up a couple of weekends and we kind of have rehearsals with the musicians and so on. And they were saying, oh no, we're pushing the tickets, we're doing this, we're doing this. We get there and there's, oh no, there's another event here. So all the stories that you tend to hear, small things like, performing at a bar, for example, and no one's there to listen to poetry. So people have been drinking all day, and you're towards the end of the event, and you're trying to perform, and it's just no, the people are way too inebriated to even begin to to catch what you're saying as a poet. So some of those things, and then even just income, trying to make an income. I remember leaving a job once to do this for 8 months, and things were just falling through, and it was so difficult. I ended up going back to campus and kind of work and managed to find a contract position and so on. So also been there's been a back and forth as well. So times during COVID, for example, I was fortunate to teach at a school online virtually, um, and that created a little bit of that stability for me until I could leave again. And then other things that are perhaps more creative choices. So working on this book, I took a slight sabbatical in 2023, and then in 2024, probably I've been working and finishing the book for about 6 months to sort of finalize and get the manuscript ready and editorial and so on, and get it to the publisher and so on, which has been about a 7 month process. So, but not working in that time, I just had to take time off work, take time off travel because I wasn't going to be able personally. I mean, many people can. I struggle with multitasking. So I wasn't going to be able to hold both of those things together. So I had to make the sacrifice of not working so I can create this work with the hope that it will make the impact that then allows me to do those things again. So there's a big mental health strain for artists because the work requires ongoing resilience, ongoing believing, even when you don't see the evidence up front, and this hope that someday it'll just all work out. But I'm often comforted by the conviction that this is my calling. I am supported by incredible people. I have my manager, Martin, is incredible. We've been working together for years. I was actually saying to my sister today that one thing that I know is that I'll never be led astray because I have the right people around me. I have people who just tell me that, you're up to no good. Like this is not on. This you're just completely way out of line here. Who wouldn't be afraid to say that to me if that's what was happening. The people who support everything that I do, who are showing up with it's my friend who's my social media manager is able to help me out there and all of these things. So no one can do it alone. I think this is maybe bad news for some people. It's impossible to do alone. So reaching out to your community to be able to receive help, but to also be of help to those around you, for me, it means that we are all sort of traveling together on this path that's given me any kind of longevity
So you started
in this
answering my
space.
next question, which was based on care, because you talk about mental health. And so I'm hearing you say community, connection, solidarity, keeping truth tellers around you. But when you talk about the mental health toll, I imagine that there are days when you can't get out of bed and you don't want to speak to anyone. What then? When you can't perform,
Honestly,
writer's block, whatever it is, when you've just got nothing to give, especially if you're unable to multitask and you need singular focus, and your head and your heart and your hands are not in the right place for that.
so I think my response comes from a somewhat privileged position in that I do have people around me. So when things do become especially difficult, I do have support. Because some days I just need to stay in bed. I just need to stay in that space of not being able to do the work. Um, and as I say, I know that that's come. I'm not supporting anyone. I don't have children. So those aren't things, because I know that with artists who do have those kinds of responsibilities, it's a lot more difficult to be able to take a mental health day. um, I think again, it's reaching out to community. There are times when, and I think this was part of why I took the sabbatical last year, where I felt that I was actually depleted by the output. I'd been traveling for about 2 years. I was just constantly just one performance after the other, one gig after the other, and so on. and I could feel my energy being drained and losing sense of why I was even doing what I was doing. And so it's almost like letting a field lie fallow, letting the ground rest in order to be able to be receptive, for it to be good ground again and receive the seeds, receive the rain, and be able to actually produce something beautiful. So being able, so for me, time out is about taking care of the tool, which is your entire being. It's your body, it's your voice, it's your mind, it's everything. It means that reading as much and more than you actually write, because I'm not just the source of of what I share, because that just becomes so self-referential so quickly and becomes an echo chamber. So being able to read what other people are writing, what other conversations are happening, is important in informing your own. So as difficult as it may be, something also that recently was just leaving social media. I now have someone that handles my social media because I felt that the space was forcing me, besides the amount of work it actually takes to do social media. Shout out to all social media managers, because wow, thank you, we appreciate you. That space became unhealthy for me because it was, again, sort of this echo chamber, or just lack of nuance even in conversation, and the sense of uh, externalization without real internal reflection, and responding to things in real time without taking the necessary time. And art needs time. Art is not Twitter. Art needs time. And so what happened is, as soon as I left social media, it's almost been a year now, my creative process slowed down. And that's been so important because it allows me to reflect. The poems in there I've been thinking about for years, and now they're finally mature and ready for consumption. So those kinds of things have allowed me to have deeper practice that also centralizes my well-being.
So, how then do you care for your audiences? And I ask this because you deal with difficult, complex, intense subjects. I've seen the trailer for one of the films, We're Dying Here, and that seems to deal with domestic violence, gender based violence. I'm not sure, but that's what it looks like. Um, you have you're one of the co-producers, and you voiced this film, The People of the Sun, and that talks about the extinction of a language. How do you hold your audiences? How do you say, I'm about to hit you over the head with how terrible the world is, but not because I want you to die, but because I want you to do something about it? How do you how do you finesse that balance?
Mm. I'll let you know once I've figured it out. I'll be honest. Um, i- it's something that you learn, with you're taught by the process itself. Sometimes it does feel like it's very heavy. And I remember we had this experience with an early version of We Are Dying Here, where it was just way too heavy, and it was draining on the audience instead of, kind of um,
And you could feel that.
uplifting. And we could feel that. And we had a Q&A session. So actually getting responses from the audience as well. So we worked on that in the second iteration, which is again, about the thing of not rushing and letting the work really breathe, and putting it out for feedback. That's really important. Putting the work out for feedback, taking things on, and refining further. For me, I think the care starts in the creative process. A friend of mine likes to say that whatever work I always put out, no matter how heavy, it's rooted in love. It's rooted in love. I have a deep care for us, for people, for us. So even what the foundation of it, even if it's a difficult topic, I very rarely do any work that I'm not passionate about. So my own care for it is kind of like, there's an engine behind me of like, the story needs to go out. This is why. And once we know about it, we can do something in the world. So I'm always hoping my work in some way create some shift in the world itself. And then I think it's not the artist's individual job to hold an audience. I think, you mentioned a bit earlier with traditional tales, which is, what we have in Tsomi as well, where our opening, which is in the book, so the first page of the book is actually just the opening. Iti Kwathi ke kaloku ngantsomi. So which is the introduction of an opening of a tale. So similar to Once Upon a Time, but it's almost like once once there was a tale, and then you would respond, and then the last page of the book is Phela Phela Ngantsomi, which says this is the end of my tale. And so I think that that collaborative aspect of how we know storytelling to be, that it is actually in collaboration between the storyteller and the audience. For me, it's we hold each other, we share the work, the audience receives, we sometimes solicit feedback, and that allows us to receive. So I see it as a kind of a moving energy rather than a one way, where I feel we are responsible for each other in that space. But also on a more technical aspect is just care in the selection of words and thinking carefully about how I'm expressing what it is that I'm sharing.
You bring up responsibility, and this season I've been speaking to fellow responsible leaders. You and I are belong to the BMW Foundation's Responsible Leader Network. So the question I'm asking everyone is, what does it mean to you to be a responsible, transformative, and courageous leader? And how does that show up in your work?
Hmm. I think it has to do with belonging. And I'll take it back to your initial question of how I have so many names. And it's because I belong to a lineage. I'm connected to an entire story. Those names in my clan names are my ancestors. And so I carry their stories with me. I think if we consider leadership to be an individualized thing, where we hold all the answers, we have all the knowledge, we are the source of all wisdom, and we lead these unknowing people, that's irresponsible. Responsibility is awareness of belonging and the humility to see the people that we supposedly lead or have the privilege of leading as being arbiters of knowledge themselves, holding knowledge. And it's the meeting of those two things that allows us to be able to lead responsibility. So I think find where you belong, know that you belong to that community that you lead. Um, and that the people that you lead hold immense history and knowledge and experience and wisdom, and solicit that. That's what will drive your organization, your school, your whatever, your family, your community, your church, your mosque, whatever it is. That's what will drive it forward.
And so as we close, Spokazi, indulge me with some live journaling prompts. Um, what is your deepest fear for yourself?
Forgetting my why, um, forgetting the why I do anything that I do.
What's your deepest fear for the world?
Being comfortable with and being able to justify the loss of humanity, um, being comfortable with genocide, for example, and finding ways to be able to justify that as economically viable, for example. So, where we have shifted so much from, I'll have to use this term, even though it's lost a lot of meaning in the world, but ubuntu, umntu ngumntu ngabantu, the person, a person is a person because of other people, that will have shifted so much from that tenet that we can justify genocide for economic gain.
What's the last thing you did that scared you?
Writing my book.
And three things in your fearless, your fear busting toolkit.
I'm going to borrow words from my sister. Say the true thing, not the right thing. Say the true thing, not the right thing. I'll borrow from Brene Brown. Authenticity is a superpower. Authenticity is a superpower. Um, no one, no one can live the life you've lived. No one can tell the story you can tell. So go ahead, do it.
This has been an incredibly beautiful conversation, Siphokazi Jonas, and I hope that my other guests don't feel some type of way because I didn't say that to them, even though I've enjoyed every conversation. But you gave us poems and no one else did. And so thank you so very much. Do you have a poem to close us out?
Of course,
Of
of
course you
course.
do. Of course
Um,
you do. Oh, thank you.
of course, I came prepared, and I want to thank you, Uruak, as I'm getting close to that poem. I want to thank you for your fearlessness. I think that I think fearlessness is something that can be loaned. You know, it's something you can borrow to people, borrow from, and lend to. Because when I look at your fearlessness and what you've been through, it bolsters my own. So that's all I can hope for. And I hope that this podcast is exactly that, that someone will listen to an episode and say, you know what, I'm going to borrow from their fearlessness, um,
I appreciate that.
to find
For a
to find
moment,
my
you were
own.
about
So
to
thank
cut
you.
onions, but I think I'm good.
No, no.
Okay.
All right, I'll just before we cut onions,
Okay.
I'll make sure we move away from that. Um, all right, here we go. Trying to think what to give. Okay, here we go. Big shoes, big shoes. Because I've spoken about mothers a lot. Um, I also want to encourage, you know, being able to chart our own path, to chart our own path. Big shoes. Do you remember playing dress up in your mama's shoes and bag, blouse draping to your calves? Eventually, you outgrow the things neither of you are willing to unbuckle until the only way to walk around town without limping is barefoot, bunions out, in defiance of her things which fashioned you. So I want to encourage anyone listening to this, whether your mother is in, you know, English, whether it's your mother, whatever other things that have mothered you. I'll read this again. The only way to walk around town without limping is barefoot, bunions out, in defiance of her things which fashioned you. I wish you well. If anyone listening to this, I hope that will take some of that spirit, and chart the paths that you took.
Siphokazi Jonas, thank you so very much.